story, Cape Cod Stories. Two Pairs of Shoes. I don't know exactly why Cap'n Jonadab and me went to the post office that night. We wa'n't expecting any mail, that's sartin. I guess likely we done it for the reason the feller that tumbled overboard went to the bottom. 'Twas the handiest place to go. Anyway, we was there, and I was propping up the stove with my feet and holding down a chair with the rest of me, when Jonadab heaves alongside, flying distress signals. He had an envelope in his starboard mitten, and coming to anchor with a flop in the next chair, sets shifting the thing from one hand to the other as if 'twas red hot. I watched this performance for a spell, waiting for him to say something, but he didn't, so I hailed kind of sarcastic and says, "What you doing? Playing solitaire? Which hand's ahead?" He kind of woke up then, and passes the envelope over to me. "Barzilla," he says, "what in time do you suppose that is?" 'Twas a queer looking envelope, more'n the average length fore and aft, but kind of scant in the beam. There was a puddle of red sealing wax on the back of it with a D in the middle, and up in one corner was a kind of picture thing in colors, with some printing in a foreign language underneath it. I b'lieve 'twas what they call a coat of arms, but it looked more like a patchwork comforter than it did like any coat ever I see. The envelope was addressed to Captain Jonadab Wixon, Orham, Massachusetts. I took my turn at twisting the thing around, and then I hands it back to Jonadab. "I pass," I says. "Where'd you get it?" "'Twas in my box," says he. "Must have come in to night's mail." I didn't know the mail was sorted, but when he says that, I got up and went over and unlocked my box just to show that I hadn't forgot how, and I swan to man if there wa'n't another envelope just like Jonadab's, except that 'twas addressed to Barzilla Wingate. "Humph!" says I, coming back to the stove. "You ain't the only one that's heerd from the Prince of Wales. Look here." He was the most surprised man but one on the Cape. I was the one. We couldn't make head nor tail of the business, and set there comparing the envelopes and wondering who on earth had sent 'em. Pretty soon Illy Tucker heads over towards our moorings, and says he: "What's troubling the Ancient Mariners?" he says. "Barzilla and me's got a couple of letters," says Captain Jonadab, "and we was wondering who they was from." Tucker leaned away down he's always suffering from a rush of funniness to the face and he whispers, awful solemn, "For heaven's sake, whatever you do, don't open 'em. You might find out." Then he threw off his main hatch and haw-hawed like a loon. To tell you the truth, we hadn't thought of opening 'em, not yet, so that was kind of one on us, as you might say. But Jonadab ain't so slow but he can catch up with a hearse if the horses stop to drink, and he comes back quick. "Ely," he says, looking troubled, "you ought to sew reef points on your mouth. 'Tain't safe to open the whole of it on a windy night like this. First thing you know, you'll carry away the top of your head." Well, we felt considerable better after that, having held our own on the tack, so to speak, and we walked out of the post office and up to my room in the Traveller's Rest, where we could be alone. Then we opened up the envelopes, both at the same time. Inside of each of 'em was another envelope, slick and smooth as a mackerel's back, and inside of that was a letter, printed, but looking like the kind of writing that used to be in the copybook at school. It said that Ebenezer Dillaway begged the honor of our presence at the marriage of his daughter Belle to Peter Theodosius Brown at Dillamead House, Cashmere on the Hudson, February 3, 1900, and so forth. We were surprised, of course, and pleased in one way, but in another way we wa'n't real tickled to death. You see, 'twas a good while since Jonadab and me had been to a wedding, and we know there'd be mostly young folks there, and a good many big bugs, we presumed likely, and 'twas going to cost considerable to get rigged, not to mention the price of passage and one thing and another. But Ebenezer had took the trouble to write us, and so we felt 'twas our duty not to disappoint him, and especially Peter, who had done so much for us managing the Old Home House. The Old Home House was our summer hotel at Wellmouth Port. How me and Jonadab come to be in the summer boarding trade is another story, and it's too long to tell now. We never would have been in it anyway, I cal'late, if it hadn't been for Peter. He made a howling success of our first season, and likewise helped himself along by getting engaged to the star boarder, rich old Dillaway's daughter, Ebenezer Dillaway of the Consolidated Cash Stores. Well, we see 'twas our duty to go, so we went. I had a new Sunday cutaway and light pants to go with it, so I figgered that I was pretty well found, but Cap'n Jonadab had to pry himself loose from considerable money, and every cent hurt as if 'twas nailed on. Then he had chilblains that winter, and all the way over in the Fall River boat he was fuming about them chilblains and adding up on a piece of paper how much cash he'd spent. We struck Cashmere on the Hudson about 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the day of the wedding. 'Twas a little country kind of town, smaller by a good deal than Orham, and so we cal'lated that perhaps after all the affair wouldn't be so everlasting tony. But when we hove in sight of Dillamead, Ebenezer's place, we shortened sail and pretty nigh drew out of the race. 'Twas up on a high bank over the river, and the house itself was bigger'n 4 old homes spliced together. It had a fair-sized township around it in the shape of land, with a high stone wall for trimming on the edges. There was trees, and places for flower beds in summer, and the land knows what. We see right off that this was the real Cashmere on the Hudson. The village folks were stranded on the flats. Old Dillaway filled the whole ship channel. "Well," I says to Jonadab, "it looks to me as if we was getting out of soundings. What do you say to coming about and making a quick run for Orham again?" But he wouldn't hear of it. "S'pose I spent all that money on duds for nothing?" he says. "No, sir, by thunder! I ain't scared of Peter Brown, nor her that's going to be his wife. And I ain't scared of Ebenezer, neither. It's no matter if he does live in the manufacturer's building, with 2,000 or 3,000 fathom of front fence," he says. Some years ago Jonadab got reckless and went on a cut-rate excursion to the World's Fair out in Chicago, and ever since then he's been comparing things with the Manufacturers' Building or the Palace of Agriculture or Streets of Cairo or some other outlandish place. "All right," says I. "Darn the torpedoes. Keep her as she is. You can fire when ready, Gridley." So we sot sail for what we jedged was Ebenezer's front gate, and just as we made it a man comes whistling round the bend in the path, and I'm blessed if 'twa'n't Peter T. Brown. He was rigged to kill, as usual, only more so. "Hello, Peters," I says. "Here we be." If ever a feller was surprised, Brown was that feller. He looked like he'd struck a rock where there was deep water on the chart. "Well, I'll be," he begun, and then stopped. "What in the—" he commenced again, and again his breath died out. Finally he says, "Is this you, or had I better quit and try another pipe?" We told him 'twas us, and it seemed to me that he wa'n't nigh so tickled as he'd ought to have been. When he found we'd come to the wedding, 'count of Ebenezer sending us word, he didn't say nothing for a minute or so. "Of course we HAD to come," says Jonadab. "We felt 'twouldn't be right to disappoint Mr. Dillaway." Peter kind of twisted his mouth. "That's so," he says. "It'll be worth more'n a box of diamonds to him. Do him more good than joining a Don't Worry Club. Well, come on up to the house and ease his mind." So we done it, and Ebenezer acted even more surprised than Peter. I can't tell you anything about the house nor the fixings in it. It beat me a mile, that house did. We had a room somewheres up on the hurricane deck, with brass bunks and plush carpets and crocheted curtains and electric lights. I swan there was looking glasses in every corner. Big ones, man's size. I remember Cap'n Jonadab hollering to me that night when he was getting ready to turn in, "For the land's sakes, Barzilla," says he, "turn out them lights, will you? I ain't over and above bashful, but them looking glasses make me feel as if I was undressing along with all hands and the cook." The house was full of company, and more kept coming all the time. Swells, don't talk. We felt about as much at home as a cow in a dory. But we was there 'cause Ebenezer had asked us to be there. So we kept on the course and didn't signal for help. Traveling through the rooms downstairs where the folks was a good deal like dodging icebergs up on the banks, but one or two noticed us enough to dip the colors, and one was real sociable. He was a kind of slow-spoken, city feller, dressed as if his clothes was poured over him hot and then left to cool. His last name had a splice in the middle of it. 'Twas Catesby Stuart. Everybody, that is, most everybody, called him Phil. Well, sir, Phil cottoned to Jonadab and me right away. He'd get us, one on each wing, and go through that house asking questions. He pumped me and Jonadab dry about how we come to be there, and told us more yarns than a few 'bout Dillaway and how rich he was. I remember he said that he only wished he had the keys to the cellar so he could show us the money bins. Said Ebenezer was so just, well, rotten with money, as you might say, that he kept it in bins down cellar, same as poor folks kept coal. Gold in one bin, silver $half in another, quarters in another, and so on. When he needed any, he'd say to a servant, "James, fetch me up a hod of change." This was only one of the fish yarns he told. They sounded kind of scaly to Jonadab and me, but if we hinted at such thing he'd pull himself together and say, "Fact, I assure you," in a way to freeze your vitals. He seemed like such a good feller that we didn't mind his telling a few big ones. We'd known good fellers afore that liked to lie, gunners and such like they were mostly. Somehow or 'nother Phil got Captain Jonadab talking boat, and when Jonadab talks boat there ain't no stopping him. He's the smartest feller in a catboat that ever handled a tiller, and he's won more races than any man on the Cape, I cal'late. Phil asked him and me if we'd ever sailed on an ice boat, and when we said we hadn't, he asked if we won't take a sail with him on the river next morning. We didn't want to put him to so much trouble on our account, but he said, "Not at all. Pleasure be all mine, I assure you." Well, 'twas his for a spell, but never mind that now. He introduced us to quite a lot of the company, men mostly. He'd see a school of 'em in a corner or under a palm tree or somewheres, and steer us over in that direction and make us known to all hands. Then he begun to show us off, so to speak, get Jonadab telling about the boats he'd sailed, or something like it, and them fellers would laugh and holler, but Phil's face wouldn't shake out a reef. He looked solemn as a funeral all the time. Jonadab and me begun to think we was making a great hit. Well, we was, but not the way we thought. I remember one of the gang gets Phil to one side after a talk like this and whispers to him, laughing like fun. Phil says to him, "My dear boy, I've been to thousands of these things," waving his flipper scornful round the premises, "and upon honor they've all been alike. Now that I've discovered something positively original, let me enjoy myself. The entertainment by the heavenly twins is only begun." I didn't know what he meant then. I do now. The marrying was done about 8 o'clock, and done with all the trimmings. All hands manned the yards in the best parlor, and Peter and Belle was hitched. Then they went away in a swell turnout, not like the derelict hacks we've seen stranded by the Cashmere Depot. And Jonadab pretty nigh took the driver's larboard ear off with a shoe Phil gave him to heave after 'em. After the wedding the folks was sitting under the palms and bushes that was growing in tubs all over the house, and the stewards, there was enough of 'em to man a four-master, was carting round punch and frozen victuals. Everybody was togged up, till Jonadab and me in our new cutaway felt like a couple of molten blackbirds at a blue jay camp meeting. Ebenezer was so busy, flying round like a pullet with its head off, that he'd hardly spoke to us since we landed, but Phil scarcely ever left us, so we wa'n't lonesome. Pretty soon he comes back from a beat into the next room, and he says: "There's a lady here that's just dying to know you gentlemen. Her name's Granby. Tell her all about the Cape. She'll like it. And by the way, my dear feller," he whispers to Jonadab, "if you want to please her mightily, congratulate her upon her boy's success in the laundry business. You understand," he says, winking, "only son and self-made man, don't you know?" Mrs. Granby was roosting all by herself on a sofy in the parlor. She was fleshy, but terrible stiff and proud, and when she moved the diamonds on her shook till her head and neck looked like one of them set pieces at the Fourth of July fireworks. She was deef, too, and used an ear trumpet pretty nigh as big as a steamer's ventilator. Maybe she was dying to know us, but she didn't have a fit trying to show it. Me and Jonadab felt we ought to be sociable, and so we sat, one on each side of her, on the sofy, and bellowed, "How d'ye do?" and "Fine day, ain't it?" into that ear trumpet. She didn't say much, but she'd couple on the trumpet and turn to whichever one of us had hailed, heeling over to that side as if her ballast had shifted. She acted to me kind of uneasy, but everybody that come into that parlor, and they kept piling in all the time, looked more middling joyful. They kept pretty quiet, too, so that every yell we let out echoed, as you might say, all round. I begun to get shaky at the knees, as if I was preaching to a big congregation. After a spell, Jonadab, not being able to think of anything more to say, and remembering Phil's orders, leans over and whoops into the trumpet. "I'm glad your son done so well with his laundry," he says. Well, sir, Phil had give us to understand that them congratulations would make a hit, and they done it. The women round the room turned red, and some of 'em covered their mouths with their handkerchiefs. The men looked glad and set up and took notice. Ebenezer wa'n't in the room, which was a mercy, but your old messmate, Catesby Stewart, looked solemn as ever and never turned a hair. But as for old lady Granby, whew! She got redder'n she was afore, which was a miracle, pretty nigh. She couldn't speak for a minute, just cackled like a hen. Then she burst out with, "How dare you!" and flounces out of that room like a hurricane. And it was still as could be for a minute, and then 2 or 3 of the girls began to squeal and giggle behind their handkerchiefs. Jonadab and me went away, too. We didn't flounce any to speak of. I guess a sneak would come nearer to telling how we quit. I see the captain heading for the stairs, and I fell into his wake. Nobody said good night, and we didn't wait to give 'em a chance. Of course, we knew we'd put our foot in it somewheres, but we didn't see just how. Even then we wa'n't really on to Phil's game. You see, when a Green Cities chap comes to Old Home House, and the land knows there's freaks enough to come, we always try to make things pleasant for him, and the last thing we'd think of was making him a show afore folks. So we couldn't believe even now 'twas done a purpose. But we was suspicious, a little. "Barzilla," says Jonadab, getting ready to turn in, "'tain't possible that that feller with the sprained last name is having fun with us, is it?" "Jonadab," says I, "I've been wondering that myself." And we wondered for an hour, and finally decided to wait a while and say nothing till we could ask Ebenezer. And the next morning one of the stewards comes up to our room with some coffee and grub, and says that Mr. Catesby Stewart requested the pleasure of our company on a 4-breakfast ice boat sail, and would meet us at the pier in half an hour. They didn't have breakfast at Ebenezer's till pretty close to dinner time, 11 o'clock, so we had time enough for quite a trip. Phil and the ice boat met us on time. I s'pose it 'twas style, but if I hadn't known I'd have swore he'd run short of duds and had dressed up in the bedclothes. I felt of his coat when he wa'n't noticing, and if it wa'n't made out of a blanket, then I never slept under one. And it made me think of my granddad to see what he had on his head, a regular nightcap, tassel and all. Phil said he was sorry we turned in so early the night before. Said he'd planned to entertain us all the evening. We didn't hurrah much at this, being suspicious, as I said, and he changed the subject to ice boats. That ice boat was a bird. I cal'lated to know a boat when I sighted one, but a flatiron on skates was something brand new. I didn't think much of it, and I could see that Jonadab didn't neither. But in about 3 shakes of a lamb's tail I was ready to take it all back and say I never said it. I'd done enough praying in the next half hour to square up for every Friday night meeting I'd missed since I was a boy. Phil got sail onto her, and we moved out kind of slow. "Now then," says he, "we'll take a little jaunt up the river. Course this isn't like one of your Cape Cod cats, but still." And then I dug my fingernails into the deck and commenced, "Now I lay me." Talk about going! 'Twas psst! And we was a mile from home. Bzzzt! And we was just getting ready to climb a bank. But 'fore she nosed the shore, Phil would put the helm over, and we'd whirl round like a windmill, with me and Jonadab biting the planking and hanging on for dear life, and my heart, that had been up in my mouth, knocking the soles of my boots off. And Captain Catesby Stewart would grin and drawl, "Course this ain't like a Orham catboat, but she does fairly well fairly. Now, for instance, how does this strike you?" It struck us. I don't think any got away. I expected every minute to land in the hereafter, and it got so that the prospect was kind of inviting, if only to get somewhere where 'twas warm. That February wind went in at the top of my stiff hat and whizzed out through the legs of my thin Sunday pants, till I felt for all the world like the ventilating pipe in an ice chest. I could see why Phil was wearing the bedclothes. What I was suffering for just then was a feather mattress on each side of me. Well, me and Jonadab was "it" for quite a spell. Phil had all the fun, and I guess he enjoyed it. If he'd stopped right then, when the fishing was good, I cal'late he'd have fetched port with a full hold. But no, he had to rub it in, so to speak, and that's where he slopped over. You know how 'tis when you're eating mince pie, it's the one more slice that fetches the nightmare. Phil stopped to get that slice. He kept whizzing up and down that river till Jonadab and me kind of got over our variousness. We could manage to get along without spreading out like porous plasters, and could set up for a minute or so on a stretch. 'Twa'n't necessary for us to hold a special religious service every time the Flatiron come about. Altogether, we was in that condition where the doctor might have held out some hopes. And in spite of the cold, we was noticing how Phil was sailing that 3-cornered sneak box, noticing and criticizing. At least I was, and Captain Jonadab, being, as I've said, the best skipper of small craft from Provincetown to Cohasset Narrows, must have had some ideas on the subject. Your old chum, Catesby Stewart, thought he was mast high so fur sailing was concerned, and anybody could see that, but he had something to l'arn. He wasn't beginning to get out all there was in that ice boat, and just then along comes another feller in the same kind of hooker and gives us a hail. There was 2 other chaps in the boat with him. "Hello, Phil!" he yells, rounding his flatiron into the wind abreast of ours and bobbing his nightcap. "I hoped you might be out. Are you game for a race?" "Archie," answers our skipper, solemn as a setting hen, "permit me to introduce you to Captain Jonadab Wixon and Admiral Barzilla Wingate, of Orham, on the Cape." I wasn't expecting to fly an admiral's pennant quite so quick, but I managed to shake out through my teeth they was chattering like a box of dice that I was glad to know the feller. Jonadab, he rattled loose something similar. "The captain and the admiral," says Phil, "having sailed the raging main for lo these many years, are now favoring me with their advice concerning the navigation of ice yachts. Archie, if you're willing to enter against such a handicap of brains and barnacles, I'll race you on a beat up to the point yonder, and then on the 10-mile run afore the wind to the buoy opposite the club, and back to the cove by Dillaway's, and we'll make it a case of wine. Is it a go?" Archie, he laughed and said it was, and all at once the race was on. Now, Phil had lied when he said we was a favoring him with advice, 'cause we hadn't said a word. But that beat up to the point wa'n't half over afore Jonadab and me was dying to tell him a few things. He handled that boat like a lobster. Archie gained on every tack and came about for the run a full minute afore us. And on the run afore the wind 'twas worse than ever. The way Phil seesawed that piece of pie back and forth over the river was a sin and a shame. He could have slacked off his mainsail and headed dead for the buoy, but no, he jiggled around like an old woman crossing the road ahead of a funeral. Captain Jonadab was on edge. Racing was where he lived, as you might say, and he fidgeted like he was setting on a pincushion. By and by he snaps out, Keep her off afore the wind. Can't you see where we're going?" Phil looked at him as if he was a graven image, and all the answer he made was, "Be calm, Barnacles, be calm." But pretty soon I couldn't stand it no longer, and I busts out with, "Keep her off, Mr. What's your name? For the Lord's sake, keep her off. He'll beat the life out of you." And all the good that done was for me to get a stare that was colder than the wind, if such a thing's possible. But Jonadab got fidgety every minute, and when we come out into the broadest part of the river, within a little ways of the buoy, he couldn't stand it no longer. "You're spilling half the wind," he yells. "Pant her for the buoy, or else you'll be licked to death. Jib her so she gets it full. Jib her, you lubber! Don't you know how? Here, let me show you." And the next thing I knew he fetched a hop like a frog, shoved Phil out of the way, grabbed the tiller, and jammed it over. She jibbed. Oh, yes, she jibbed. If anybody says she didn't, you send 'em to me. I give you my word that the Flatiron jibbed twice. Once for practice, I jedge, and then for business. She commenced by twisting and squirming like an eel. I just had sense enough to clamp my mittens onto the little brass rail by the stern and hold on. Then she jibbed the second time. She stood up on two legs. The boom come over with a slat that pretty nigh took the mast with it, and the whole shebang whirled round as if it had forgot something. I have a foggy kind of remembrance of locking my mitten clamps fast onto that rail, while the rest of me streamed out in the air like a burgy. Next thing I knew we was scooting back towards Dillaway's, with the sail catching every ounce that was blowing. Jonadab was braced across the tiller, and there behind us was the Honorable Philip Catesby Stuart, flat on his back, with his blanket legs looking like a pair of compasses, and skimming in whirligigs over the slick ice towards Albany. He hadn't had nothing to hold on to, you understand. Well, if I hadn't seen it, I wouldn't have believed that a human being could spin so long, or travel so fast on his back. His legs made a kind of smoky circle in the air over him, and he'd got such a start I thought he'd never stop a-going. He come to a place where some snow had melted in the sun, and there was a pond, as you might say, on the ice, and he went through that, heaving spray like one of them circular lawn sprinklers the summer folks have. He'd have been as pretty as a fountain if we'd had time to stop and look at him. "For the land's sakes, heave to!" I yelled, soon as I could get my breath. "You've spilled the skipper." "Skipper be durned!" howls Jonadab, squeezing the tiller and keeping on the course. "We'll come back for him by and by. It's our business to win this race." And by ginger, we did win it. The way Jonadab coaxed that cocked hat on runners over the ice was pretty. Yes, sir, pretty. He nipped her close enough to the wind'ard, and he took advantage of every single chance. He always could sail, I'll say that for him. We walked up to Archie like he'd set down to rest, and passed him afore he was within a half mile of home. We run up abreast of Dillaway's, putting on all the fancy frills of a liner coming into port, and there was Ebenezer and a whole crowd of wedding company down by the landing. "Gosh!" says Jonadab, tugging at his whiskers. "'Twas Cape Cod against New York that time, and you can't beat the Cape when it comes to getting over water, not even if the water's froze. Hey, Barzilla?" Ebenezer came hopping over the ice towards us. He looked some surprised. "Where's Phil?" he says. Now, I'd clean forgot Phil, and I guess Jonadab had, by the way he colored up. "Phil?" says he. "Phil? Oh, yes. We left him up the road a piece. Maybe we'd better go after him now." But old Dillaway had something to say. "Cap'n," he says, looking round to make sure none of the company was follering him out to the ice boat, "I've wanted to speak to you afore, but I haven't had the chance. You mustn't believe too much of what Mr. Catesby Stuart says, nor you mustn't always do just what he suggests. You see," he says, "he's a dreadful practical joker." "Yes," says Jonadab, beginning to look sick. I didn't say nothing, but I guess I looked the same way. "Yes," said Ebenezer, kind of uneasy like. "Now, in that matter of Mrs. Granby, I suppose Philip put you up to asking her about her son's laundry? Yes? Well, I thought so. You see, the fact is, her boy's a broker down in Wall Street, and he's been caught making some of what they call wash sales of stock. It's against the rules of the exchange to do that, and the papers have been full of the row. You can see," says Dillaway, "how the laundry question kind of stirred the old lady up. But, Lord, it must have been funny!" And he commenced to grin. I looked at Jonadab, and he looked at me. I thought of Marm Granby and her being dying to know us, and I thought of the lies about the heart of change and all the rest, and I give you my word I didn't grin not enough to show my wisdom teeth, anyhow. A crack in the ice an inch wide would have held me with room to spare. I know that. "Hum," grunts Jonadab, kind of dry and bitter, as if he'd been taking wormwood tea. "I see. He's been having a good time making dern fools out of us." "Well," says Ebenezer, "not exactly that, perhaps, but—" And then along comes Archie and his crowd in the other ice boat. "Hi!" he yells. "Who sailed that boat of yours? He knew his business all right. I never saw anything better. Phil! Why, where is Phil?" I answered him. "Phil got out when we jibbed," I says. "Was THAT Phil?" he hollers, and then the three of 'em just roared. "Oh, by Jove, you know," says Archie, "that's the funniest thing I ever saw. And on Phil, too. He'll never hear the last of it at the club. Hey, boys?" And then they just bellered and laughed again. When they'd gone, Jonadab turned to Ebenezer and he says, "That taking us out on his boat was another case of having fun with a countryman, hey?" "I guess so," says Dillaway. "I b'lieve he told one of the guests that he was going to put Cape Cod on ice this morning." I looked away up the river where a little black speck was just getting to shore, and I thought of how chilly the wind was out there, and how that ice water must have felt, and what a long way 'twas from home. And then I smiled, slow and wide, and there was a barge load of joy in every inch of that smile. "It's a cold day when Phil loses a chance for a joke," says Ebenezer. "'Tain't exactly what you'd call summery just now," I says. And we hauled down sail, run the ice boat up to the wharf, and went up to our room to pack our extension cases for the next train. "You see," says Jonadab, putting in his other shirt, "it's easy enough to get the best of Cape folks on wash sales and lying, but when it comes to boats, that's a different pair of shoes." "I guess Phil'll agree with you," I says. End of story 1. Story 2, The Count and the Manager. The way we got into the hotel business in the first place come around like this. Me and Captain Jonadab went down to Wellmouthport one day, long in March, to look at some property he'd had left him. Jonadab's Aunt Sophrony had moved kind of sudden from that village to Beulah Land. There's a good ways apart, too, and Captain Jonadab had come in for the old farm, he being the only near relative. When you go to Wellmouth Port you get off the cars at Wellmouth Center and then take Labe Bierce's barge and ride 4 miles, and then, if the horse don't take a notion to lay down in the road and go to sleep, or a wheel don't come off, or some other surprise party ain't sprung on you, you come to a place where there's a Baptist chapel that needs painting, and a little 2-for-a-cent store that needs trade, and 2 or 3 houses that need building over, and any Lord's quantity of scrub pines and beach grass and sand. Then you take Labe's word for it that you've got to Wellmouth Port and get out of the barge and try to remember you're a church member. Well, Aunt Sophrony's house was a mile or more from the place where the barge stopped, and Jonadab and me, we hoofed it up there. We bought some cheese and crackers and canned things at the store 'cause we expected to stay overnight in the house, and knew there wasn't no other way of getting provender. We got there after a spell and set down on the big piazza with our souls full of gratitude and our boots full of sand. Great big old-fashioned house with 14 big bedrooms in it, big barn, sheds, and one thing or another, and perched right on top of a hill with 5 or 6 acres of ground round it. And how the March wind did whoop in off the sea and howl and screech lonesomeness through the pine trees! You take it in the middle of the night, and with the shutters rattling and the old joists a creaking and Jonadab snoring like a chap sawing hollow logs, and if it wasn't joy then my name ain't Barzilla Wingate. I don't wonder Aunt Sophrony died. I'd have died long afore she did if I knew I was checked plumb through to perdition. There'd be some company where I was going, anyhow. The next morning, after ballasting up with the truck we'd bought at the store, the feller most keeled over when he found we was going to pay cash for it, we went out on the piazza again and looked at the breakers and the pine trees and the sand, and held our hats on with both hands. "Jonadab," says I, "what'll you take for your heirloom?" "Well," he says, "Barzilla, the way I feel now, I think I'd take a return ticket to Orham and be glad of being took up for swindling at that." Neither of us says nothing more for a spell, and first thing you know we heard a carriage rattling somewhere up the road. I was shipwrecked once and spent 2 days in a boat looking for a sail. When I heard that rattling I felt just the way I done when I sighted the ship that picked us up. "Judas," says Jonadab, "there's somebody coming." We jumped out of our chairs and put for the corner of the house. There WAS somebody coming, a feller in a buggy, and he hitched his horse to the front fence and come whistling up the walk. He was a tall chap with a smooth face, kind of sharp and knowing, and with a stiff hat set just a little on one side. His clothes was new and about a week ahead of up to date. His shoes shined till they lit up the lower half of his legs, and his pants was creased so you could mow with 'em. Cool and slick. Say, in the middle of that dead lines, and compared to Jonadab and me, he looked like a bird of paradise in a coop of molten pullets. "Captain Wixon?" he says to me, sticking out a gloved flipper. "Not guilty," says I. "There's the skipper. My name's Wingate." "Glad to have the pleasure, Mr. Wingate," he says. "Captain Wixon, yours truly." We shook hands, and he took each of us by the arm and piloted us back to the piazza like a tug with a couple of coal barges. He pulled up a chair, crossed his legs on the rail, reached into the for'ard hatch of his coat, and brought out a cigar case. "Smoke up," he says. We done it, I holding my hat to shut off the wind, while Jonadab used up 2 cards of matches getting the first light. When we got the cigars to going finally, the feller says: "My name's Brown, Peter T. Brown. I read about your fallen heir to this estate, Captain Wixon, in a New Bedford paper. I happened to be in New Bedford then, representing the John B. Wilkins Unparalleled All-Star Uncle Tom's Cabin and 10 Nights in a Barroom Company. It isn't my reg'lar line, the show business, but it produced the necessary ham and every day and the Excelsior sleep inviter every night, so but never mind that. Soon as I read the paper I came right down to look at the property. Having rubbered, back I go to Orham to see you. Your handsome and talented daughter says you are over here. That'll be about all. Here I am. Now then, listen to this." He went under his hatches again, rousted out a sheet of paper, unfolded it, and read something like this. I know it by heart: "The great sea leaps and splashes before you as it leaped and splashed in the old boyhood days. The sea wind sings to you as it sang of old. The old dreams come back to you, the dreams you dreamed as you slumbered upon the cornhusk mattress in the clean, sweet little chamber of the old home. Forgotten are the cares of business, the scramble for money, the ruthless hunt for fame. Here are the perfect rest and perfect peace." "Now, what place would you say I was describing?" says the feller. "Heaven," says Jonadab, looking up reverent like. You never see a body more disgusted than Brown. "Get out!" he snaps. "Do I look like the advanced agent of glory? Listen to this one." He unfurls another sheet of paper and goes off on a tack about like this: "The old home. You who sit in your luxurious apartments, attended by your liveried servants, eating the costly dishes that bring you dyspepsia and kindred evils, what would you give to go back once more to the simple, cleanly living of the old house in the country? The old home where the nights were cool and refreshing, the sleep deep and sound, where the huckleberry pies that mother fashioned were swimming in fragrant juice, where the shells of the clams for the chowder were snow white and the chowder itself a triumph, where there were no voices but those of the wind and sea. No, don't!" bursts out Jonadab. "Don't! I can't stand it." He was mopping his eyes with his red bandana. I was considerable shook up myself. The dear land knows we was more used to huckleberry pies and clam chowder than we was to liveried servants and costly dishes, but there was something in the way that feller read off that slush that just worked the pump handle. A hog would have cried. I know I couldn't help it. As for Peter T. Brown, he fairly crowed. "It gets you," he says. "I knew it would. And it'll get a heap of others, too. Well, we can't send 'em back to the old home, but we can trot the old home to them, or a mighty good imitation of it. Here it is, right here." And he waves his hand up toward Aunt Sophrony's cast-off palace. Captain Jonadab set up straight and sputtered like a firecracker. A man hates to be fooled. "Old home!" he snorts. "Old county jail, you mean." And then that Brown feller took his feet down off the rail, hitched his chair right in front of Jonadab and me, and commenced to talk. And how he did talk! Say, he could talk a Hyannis fisherman into a missionary. I wish I could remember all he said. 'Twould make a book as big as a dictionary, but 'twould be worth the trouble of writing it down. 'Fore he got through he talked $1,000 out of Captain Jonadab, and it takes a pretty hefty lecture to squeeze a quarter out of him. To make a long yarn short, this was his plan. He proposed to turn Aunt Sophrony's wind plantation into a hotel for summer boarders, and it wasn't going to be any worn-out regulation kind of a summer hotel, neither. "Confound it, man," he says. "They're sick of hot and cold water, elevators, bell wires with a nigger on the end, and all that. There's a raft of old codgers that'd call themselves self-made men, meaning that the Creator won't own 'em and they take the responsibility themselves, that are always wishing they could go somewheres like the shacks where they lived when they were kids. They're always talking about it and wishing they could go to the old home and rest. Rest? Why, say, there's as much rest to this place as there is sand, and there's enough of that to scour all the knives in creation." "But 'twill cost so like the dickens to furnish it," I says. "Furnish it?" says he. "Why, that's just it. It won't cost nothing to furnish it. Nothing to speak of. I went through the house day before yesterday. Crawled in the kitchen window it's all right, you can count the spoons and there's 8 of those bedrooms furnished just right, corded bedsteads. painted bureaus with glass knobs, God Bless Our Home and Uncle Jeremiah's coffin plate on the wall, rag mats on the floor, and all the rest. All she needs is a little more of the same stuff that I can buy around here for next to nothing I used to buy for an auction room and a little paint and fixings, and there she is. All I want from you folks is a little money. I'll chuck in 250 myself, and you two can be proprietors and treasurers if you want to. But active manager and publicity man, that's yours cheerily, Peter Theodosius Brown." And he slapped his plaid vest. Well, he talked all the forenoon and all the way to Orham on the train and most of that night. And when he heaved anchor, Jonadab had agreed to put up 1,000 and I was in for 500, and Peter contributed 250 and experience and nerve, and the Old Home House was off the ways. And by the 1st of May 'twas open and ready for business, too. You never see such a driver as that feller Brown was. He had a new wide piazza built all round the main buildings, painted everything up fine, hired the 3 best women cooks in Wellmouth and there's some good cooks on Cape Cod, too and a half dozen chamber girls and waiters. He had some trouble getting corded beds and old bureaus for the empty rooms, but he got 'em finally. He bought the last bed of Beriah Burgess up at East Harness and had quite a dicker getting it. He thought he ought to get $5 for it, says Brown, telling Jonadab and me about it. Said he hated to part with it because his grandmother died in it. I told him I couldn't see any good reason why I should pay more for a bed just because it had killed his grandmother. So we split up and called it $3. 'Twas too much money, but we had to have it. And the advertisements! They was sent everywhere. Lots of 'em was what Peter called reading notices, and them he mostly got for nothing, for he could talk an editor foolish same as he could anybody else. By the middle of April most of our money was gone, but every room in the house was let and we had applications coming in by the pailful. And the folks that come had money, too. They had to have to pay Brown's rates. I always felt like a robber or a Standard Oil director every time I looked at the books. The most of 'em was rich folks, self-made men, just like Peter prophesied, and they brought their wives and daughters and slept on corn husks and eat chowder and said 'twas great and just like old times. And they got the rest we advertised. We didn't cheat 'em on rest. By 10 o'clock pretty nigh all hands was abed, and 'twas so still all you could hear was the breakers or the wind, or p'raps a groan coming from a window where some boarder had turned over in his sleep and a corncob in the mattress had raked him crossways. There was one old chap that we'll call Dillaway, Ebenezer Dillaway. That wasn't his name. His real one's too well known to tell. He runs the Dillaway Combination Stores that are all over the country. In them stores you can buy anything and buy it cheap. Cheapness is Ebenezer's stronghold and job lots is his sheet anchor. He'll sell you a mowing machine and a grass seed to grow the hay to cut with it. He'll sell you a suit of clothes for $2.25, and for 10 cents more he'll sell you glue enough to stick it together again after you've worn it out in the rain. He'll sell you anything, and he's got cash enough to sink a ship. He come to the Old Home House with his daughter, and he took to the place right away. Said 'twas for all the world like where he used to live when he was a boy. He liked the grub, and he liked the corn husks, and he liked Brown. Brown had a way of stealing a thing and yet paying enough for it to square the law that hit Ebenezer where he lived. His daughter liked Brown, too, and 'twas easy enough to see that Brown liked her. She was a mighty pretty girl, the kind Peter called a queen, and the active manager took to her like a cat to a fish. They was together more'n half the time, getting up sailing parties, or playing croquet, or setting up on the Lover's Nest, which was a kind of slab summer house Brown had rigged up on the bluff where Aunt Sophrony's pig pens used to be in the old days. Me and Jonadab see how things was going, and we'd look at one another and wink and shake our heads when the pair'd go by together. But all that was afore the count come aboard. We got our first letter from the count about the 3rd of June. The writing was all over the plate like a biled dinner, and the English looked like it had been shook up in a bag, but it was signed with a 9-fathom, toggle-jinted name that would give a poll parrot the lockjaw, and had the word "count" on the bow of it. You never see a feller happier than Peter T. Brown. "Can he have rooms?" says Peter. "Can he? Well, I should rise to ellicute. He can have the best there is if yours truly has to bunk in the coop with the gladsome Plymouth Rock. That's what. He says he's a count, and he'll be advertised as a count from this place to where rolls the Oregon." And he was, too. The papers was full of how Count What's-his-name was hanging out at the Old Home House, and we got more letters from rich old women and pork-pickling money-bags than you could shake a stick at. If you want to catch the free and equal nabob of a glorious republic, bait up with a little nobility, and you'll have your salt wet in no time. We had to rig up rooms in the carriage house, and me and Jonadab slept in the haymow. The count himself hove in sight on June 15th. He was a little smoked Italian man with a pair of legs that would have been carried away in a gale, and a black mustache with waxed ends that you'd think would punch holes in the pillow case. His talk was like his writing, only worse, but from the time his big trunk with the foreign labels was carried upstairs, he was skipper and all hands of the Old Home House. And the funny part of it was that old man Dillaway was as much gone on him as the rest. For a self-made American article he was the worst gone on this machine-made importation that ever you see. I s'pose when you've got more money than you can spend for straight goods, you naturally go in for buying curiosities. I can't see no other reason. Anyway, from the minute the count come over the side, it was, "Good by, Peter." The foreigner was first oar with the old man and general consort for the daughter. Whenever there was a sailing trip on or a spell of roosting in the Lover's Nest, Ebenezer would see that the count looked out for the queen, while Brown stayed on the piazza and talked bargains with papa. It worried Peter, you could see that. He'd set in the barn with Jonadab and me, thinking, and all at once he'd bust out: "Bless that Dago's heart! I haven't chummed in with the degenerate aristocracy much in my time, but somewhere or other I've seen that chap before. Now where? For the first 2 weeks the count paid his board like a major. Then he let it slide. Jonadab and me was a little worried, but he was advertising us like fun. His photographs, snapshots by Peter, was getting into the papers, so we judged he was a good investment. But Peter got bluer and bluer. One night we was in the setting room, me and Jonadab and the count and Ebenezer. The queen and the rest of the boarders was abed. The count was spinning a pigeon English yarn of how he'd fought a duel with rapiers. When he'd finished, old Dillaway pounded his knee and sung out: "That's business! That's the way to fix 'em. No lawsuits, no argument, no delays. Just take 'em out and punch holes in 'em. Did you hear that, Brown?" "Yes, I heard it," says Peter, kind of absent-minded like. "Fighting with razors, wasn't it?" Now, there wa'n't nothing to that. 'Twas just some of Brown's sarcastic spite getting the best of him. But I give you my word that the count turned yellow under his brown skin, kind of like mud rising from the bottom of a pond. "What do you say?" he says, bending for'ards. "Mr. Brown was mistaken, that's all," says Dillaway. "He meant rapiers." "But why razors? Why razors?" says the count. Now, I was watching Brown's face, and all at once I see it light up like you'd turned a searchlight on it. He settled back in his chair and fetched a long breath, as if he was satisfied. Then he grinned and begged pardon and talked a blue streak for the rest of the evening. Next day he was the happiest thing in sight, and when Miss Dillaway and the count went lovers' nesting he didn't seem to care a bit. All of a sudden he told Jonadab and me that he was going to Boston that evening on business and wouldn't be back for a day or so. He wouldn't tell what the business was, either, and just whistled and laughed and sung, "Good-by, Susanna, don't you grieve for me," till train time. He was back again 3 nights afterward, and he come right out to the barn without going nigh the house. He had another feller with him, a kind of shabby-dressed Italian man with curly hair. "Fellers," he says to me and Jonadab, "this is my friend, Mr. Macaroni. He's going to engineer the barber shop for a while." Well, we just let our other barber go, so we didn't think anything of this, but when he said that his friend Spaghetti was going to stay in the barn for a day or so, and that we needn't mention that he was there, we thought that was funny. But Peter done a lot of funny things the next day. One of them was to set a feller painting a side of the house by the count's window that didn't need painting at all. And when the feller quit for the night, Brown told him to leave the ladder where it was. That evening the same crowd was together in the setting room. Peter was as lively as a cricket, talking all the time. By and by he says, "Oh, I say, I want you to see the new barber. He can shave anything from a note to a porcupine. Come in here, Chianti," he says, opening the door and calling out, "I want you." And in come the new Italian man, smiling and bowing and looking meek and lowly, sick and sore, as the song says. Well, we laughed at Brown's talk and asked the Italian all kinds of fool questions. Nobody noticed that the count wa'n't saying nothing. Pretty soon he gets up and says he guesses he'll go to his room 'cause he feels sort of sick. And I tell you, he looked sick. He was yellower than he was the other night, and he walked like he hadn't got his sea legs on. Old Dillaway was terrible sorry, and kept saying if there wasn't something he could do, but the count put him off and went out. "Now, that's too bad," says Brown. "Spaghetti, you needn't wait any longer." So the other Italian went out, too. And then Peter T. Brown turned loose and talked the way he done when me and Jonadab first met him. He just spread himself. He told of this bargain that he'd made and that sharp trade he'd turned, while we sat there and listened and laughed like a parcel of fools. And every time that Ebenezer'd get up to go to bed, Peter'd trot out a new yarn, and he'd have to stop to listen to that. And it got to be 11 o'clock, and then 12, and then 1. It was just about a quarter past 1, and we was laughing our heads off at one of Brown's jokes, when out under the back window there was a jingle and a thump and a kind of groaning and wiggling noise. "What on earth is that?" says Dillaway. "I shouldn't be surprised," says Peter, cool as a mackerel on ice, "if that was his Royal Highness the Count." He took up the lamp, and we all hurried outdoors and round the corner. And there, sure enough, was the count, sprawling on the ground with his leather satchel alongside of him and his foot fast in a big steel trap that was hitched by a chain to the lower round of the ladder. He reared up on his hands when he see us and started to say something about an outrage. "Oh, it's all right, your majesty," says Brown. "Hi, Chianti, come here a minute. Here's your old college chum, the count. Been and put his foot in it." When the new barber showed up, the count never made another move, just wilted like a morning glory after sunrise. But you never see a worse upset man than Ebenezer Dillaway. "But what does this mean?" says he, kind of wild like. "Why don't you take that thing off his foot?" "Oh," says Peter, "he's been elongating my pedal extremity for the last month or so. I don't see why I should kick if he pulls his own for a while. You see," he says, "it's this way. Ever since his grace condescended to lend the glory of his countenance to this humble roof," he says, "it's stuck in my mind that I'd seen the said countenance somewhere before. The other night, when our conversation was trifling with the razor subject, and the Grand Lama here," that's the name he called the count, "was throwing in details about his carving his friends, it flashed across me where I'd seen it. About a couple of years ago I was selling the guileless rural druggists contiguous to Scranton, Pennsylvania, the tasty and happy combination called Dr. Bulger's Electric Liver Cure, the same being a sort of electric light for shady livers, so to speak. I made my headquarters at Scranton, And while there my hair was shortened and my chin smoothed in a neat but gaudy barber shop, presided over by my friend Spaghetti here and my equally valued friend, the count. So, says Peter, smiling and cool as ever, when it came back to me, as the song says, I journeyed to Scranton accompanied by a photograph of his lordship. I was lucky enough to find Macaroni in the same old shop. He knew the count's classic profile at once. It seems his majesty had hit up the lottery a short time previous for a few hundred and had given up barbering. I suppose he'd read in the papers that the imitation count was stylish and profitable, and so he tried it on. It may be, says Brown offhand, that he thought he might marry some rich girl. There's some fool fathers, judging by the papers, that are willing to sell their daughters for the proper kind of tag on a package like him. Old man Dillaway kind of made a face, as if he'd ate something that tasted bad, but he didn't speak. And so, says Peter, Spaghetti and I came to the old home together, he to shave for 12 per, and I to set traps, etc. That's a good trap, he says, nodding. I bought it in Boston. I had the teeth filed down, but the man that sold it said 'twould hold a horse. I left the ladder by his grace's window, thinking he might find it handy after he'd seen his friend of other days, particularly as the back door was locked. "And now," goes on Brown, short and sharp, "let's talk business. Count," he says, "you are set back on the books about 60 odd for Old Home Comforts. We'll cut off half of that and charge it to advertising. You draw well, as the man said about the pipe, but the other 30 you'll have to work out. You used to shave like a bird. I'll give you $12 a week to chip in with Macaroni here and barber the borders." But Dillaway looked anxious. "Look here, Brown," he says, "I wouldn't do that. I'll pay his board bill and his traveling expenses if he clears out this minute. It seems tough to set him shaving after he's been such a big gun round here." I could see right off that the arrangement suited Brown first rate and was exactly what he'd been working for, but he pretended not to care much for it. "Oh, I don't know," he says. "I'd rather be a sterling barber than a plated count. But anything to oblige you, Mr. Dillaway." So the next day there was a nobleman missing at the Old Home House, and all we had to remember him by was a trunkful of bricks. And Peter T. Brown and the queen was roosting in the Lover's Nest, and the new Italian was busy in the barber shop. He could shave, too. He shaved me without a pull, and my face ain't no plush sofy, neither. And before the season was over the engagement was announced. Old Dillaway took it pretty well, considering. He liked Peter, and his having no money to speak of didn't count, because Ebenezer had enough for all hands. The old man said he'd been hoping for a son-in-law sharp enough to run the Consolidated Stores after he was gone, and it looked, he said, as if he'd found him. End of Story 2.